My name's Thomas Sigler, and along with Fenghua Pan, we are organizing this from the Eastern Hemisphere. I am currently in Brisbane, Australia, where it is 10 p.m., and Fenghua is in Beijing, where it's 8 p.m. So we decided to do a little bit later timing for the second batch of the FINGEO Seminar Series. So this tranche of the FINGEO Seminar Series includes 6 lectures, of which the first is today Professor Markus Hesse. So Professor Markus Hesse is a professor of urban studies at the University of Luxembourg's DGO, or Department of Geography and Spatial Planning. His background is in geography from the University of Münster and spatial planning from the University of Dortmund, and he obtained a postdoctoral degree from the Freie Universität of Berlin. I've worked with Markus for a few years and worked on a very exciting project in which we consider relational cities. So we looked at cities led by Markus that were heavily involved in brokerage and intermediary activities, and specifically comparing Luxembourg against Geneva and Singapore. So Markus is an elected member of the Academy of Spatial Research and Planning, which is ARL in Germany, and a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society in the UK, and sits on several advisory boards and scientific councils. So just a really quick bit of housekeeping before we get started. So I can see that Derek has directed everyone to join FINGEO if you haven't already, and the link is in the chat box. In terms of the actual lecture, please turn your microphones off. For the lecture component, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions as Markus concludes. So we're aiming for about 30 to 35 minutes of lecture, followed by hopefully what's a very exciting 20-minute Q&A session. Thanks to Fenghua and Derek, Karen, and the RSA team especially for helping us out with this, and of course to Markus for coming. And finally, before I shut up, Karen Lai will send around a link for WonderMe, which is an app that allows people to sort of kick on virtually, kind of like a virtual pub meeting, and that link will be sent around shortly in the chat. So finally, the options for questions are, if you do have a question, you can ask it afterwards by turning your microphone and your camera on, please, or you can type it into the chat, and I'll try to have some sort of moderating system, of course, depending on the number of questions, whether we can answer them all or whether we have to consolidate them. So without further ado, thank you very much, Markus. Over to you.
Thanks, Thomas. I'm trying to share my screen and to minimize pictures here.
We can see it.
So, yep. Hello, everybody. Thanks very much for this invitation. I'm delighted to talk to you. Today, I will present the case of Luxembourg's urban geography, giving you an overview of how the financial center has emerged, what the urban geographical implications of this process are about, and how policy and planning have responded to this development or made it possible. And the subtitle also relates to some recent debates that are going on in the city about how urban development should be organized now and in the future. So this is my agenda for the next half hour, actually. A quick overview of both the subject of my talk and how it actually emerged, and then coming to the urban implications of what that means to be small but global, which I guess is a pretty distinct thing. And then discussing the policy and planning dimension, how governance has been setting this in place and is dealing with the issues. And for particular reasons, I will also make a quick outlook in terms of what is the future prospect in times of Brexit and COVID-19. The stuff that I'm presenting today is based on almost 13 years of doing research in and around Luxembourg, a sort of thick description that I'm trying to apply by various means, and the conduct of 3 major research projects that were funded by the Fonds National de la Recherche, one already mentioned by Thomas. And in what I present here also follow close collaboration within and beyond our Department of Geography and Spatial Planning at the University of Luxembourg, particularly with my fellow colleagues and collaborators Tom Becker, Constance Carr, and Catherine Wong. Also Sabine Derry from LISA, who I've already noted is also following us today. And of course, Thomas, who luckily joined us as a guest professor recently. So first of all, I will present a short conceptual sketch. So what is the particular lens that we are used to apply when analyzing the specificities of the case? And it is important here to note that when speaking of Luxembourg, it's a bit fuzzy since we mean both state and capital city at a time. In our view, the two are blended in what we would call city-state formation. It's not a city-state officially, but it looks pretty much like that in all the political practice. And given its extraordinary small size, it is difficult to make a proper distinction between the two levels. Also, since the state is almost everywhere involved in almost all levels and activities of politics. Our main contention is that small size on the one hand and huge economic power on the other are a combination that makes urban development, the spatial built environment setting in which all this unfolds, pretty critical. What is our conceptual frame here? Of course, it has a lot to do with the debates about global cities and what Thomas already mentioned, relational cities. In their sketch of what could be called some historical roots of the whole global cities debate, Peter Rimmer and Howard Dick once mentioned 4 properties that consider a city being a global or a world city. And these 4 are demographic size, economic role, geographic reach, and also cultural diversity. The case that I'm presenting here has all these properties but one, which is size. It has nevertheless illustrated that geographical reach provides a means to compensate for specific limitations in terms of size, both as concerns population and also territory. In the words of Olds and Young, 2004, it has demonstrated a remarkable ability to extract streams of profit from an extraterritorial terrain. And this also evokes previous frames, such as the very famous one developed by William Alonso, his notion of borrowed size, which he had indeed applied to the Low Countries, so Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. And these small places, by various historical traditions and economic practices, were trying to make a gain of reaching beyond their own territory simply because they had to. Our main frame of reference is, just need to follow on here, is relational urbanization. In this context, cities and regions are analyzed no longer as fixed, bounded territories, which are primarily based on agglomeration, but as subjects in a system of wider networks and relations. Of course, one source of inspiration is Doreen Massey's work on London, which we found extremely inspiring. These places are situated between different international systems. They are mediating between different spatial scales, particularly the global and the regional. Essential is their ability to attract, manage, and valorize flows of all kinds, being these people, currency, commodities, or policy concepts. And following McCann and Ward's work on policy mobilities, this also indicates how urban actors manage and struggle over the local impacts of global flows, and also the analysis of how they engage in global circuits of policy knowledge. This is our reading of how relationality comes together. So their main building blocks are first, global positionality, second, the successful management of flows, and third, a related governance. And this unfolds actually against the background of a very specific historical framework condition. And this is one that can't be easily copied by others. So there are ups and downs in, if you follow these developments of certain places that may be understood as relational, but they are certainly quite distinct in their ability to play this property out. As a result of this property being relational, Luxembourg scores rather highly on the global map of the centers of the finance and service industries. As you all know, probably this may be also the questions behind these rankings and indicators, but if we would simply follow this, and the government, for instance, in Luxembourg is also meticulously tracking the various ranks that Luxembourg is showing up on, it oscillates somewhere in the range of the top 20 of the global financial marketplaces and the top 5 in Europe, respectively. Currently number 3 behind Frankfurt and London, Frankfurt and Zurich, depending on how you define Europe. The same applies for the GOG database, also standard means of work in these communities that classify cities based on the magnitude of the business services connections, with APS, advanced producer services, being the main indicator. Here, Luxembourg ranks as alpha minus level among a range of much bigger leading metropolitan areas internationally. Again, this is a striking mismatch between size and power, and this is a very important point for us to approach this subject matter. So let's take a closer look how the country and the capital city actually have developed in recent times. How did this small place become so international, if not global? If we put it in a nutshell, Luxembourg, we would see it as a global city-state formation that is active and developing at different spatial scales. It is a capital city with roughly 125,000 inhabitants, 160,000 in the city region, and the country as such has about 625,000 inhabitants nationally. And there's a larger sphere of influence called the Greater Region, which includes parts of Belgium, France, and Germany, with overall 11 million people, but probably there's only a part of that closely, but very intensively related to Luxembourg. It is also notable that the country's labor market now comprises about 470,000 active people. So the relation between the number of inhabitants and the number of active workers is pretty strange here. Besides the financial center and the focus on corporate headquarters and services, Luxembourg is also the third seat of the European Union. This is something that started in 1958 and turned out to be a longer process of political bargaining and negotiation until in 1992 it was confirmed that Luxembourg serves the European Union, besides Brussels as the home of the Commission and Strasbourg as the home of the European Parliament, which also fits with the notion of flows within this concept of relationality. Is the property of Luxembourg as serving as one of the bigger European hub of air cargo logistics. When I'm asked to present the case of Luxembourg to both domestic and international and also professional and maybe more general public audiences, I'm used to refer to these 3 different spatial scales in more detail. First of all, this is also policy relevant, Luxembourg comprises a territory that is subdivided in 102 municipalities. And these municipalities are autonomous and they have the privilege of building and planning rights. And we only have 2 major levels of admin and policy decision-making in the country, which is the state and commune. And this is pretty foundational for the country as such. Roughly a quarter of the population and probably half of the economic activity is taking place here in this area of the capital city and its suburbs. And less than a quarter of the population goes to a handful of medium-sized, partly old industrial towns that are situated here in the southern area, which is the old industrialized mining area and steelworking region, the so-called Minette, And these are smaller towns in the range of 10 to 25, 30,000 inhabitants. And the rest of the population, the other half, is scattered across the country in small towns and mainly rural, if not bucolic areas. Secondly, we have this phenomenon of Luxembourg's embeddedness in the greater region. It is a center of a regional cross-border labor market, which is very closely connected to these regions in Belgium, the Wallonian region, the Lorraine in France, and Rhineland-Palatinate and the Saarland region in Germany. From there, every day, every workday, more than 200,000 commuters are flocking in for work to Luxembourg, probably by 50% to the capital city. And in that, they contribute to doubling the workday population of the small city in particular. Various sectors of the economy, this is a very important issue, simply depend on the inflow of this workforce, which is taxi drivers, people who are catering in the restaurants, but also the whole healthcare industry, which was considered to be pretty essential when the pandemic was hitting the country. Many of these are coming from France, Belgium, Germany. So this is vital for the development of Luxembourg. And thirdly, some of you might be familiar with this illustration, and I saw that Derek is also with us today. Luxembourg operates a multitude of global linkages and network connections due to its financial center, corporate headquarter, and holding functions, and by being the seat of political bodies such as the EU, all affecting local politics, but rarely taken into account when local politics, planning issues, development issues are being discussed and negotiated. And the other thing is that these developments that make Luxembourg showing up here with much bigger and much more powerful partners like the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, the US in these financial services, this property actually makes the place being pretty critical in global terms. The striking economic and also demographic dynamics have actually happened over a historically rather short period of time. And when looking at this chart provided by the World Bank on per capita GDP, I noticed that there were in the recent past particularly two periods where an accelerated growth of per capita GDP has happened, which was between 1985 and 1996, where the GDP per capita actually has grown fourfold, and the period between 2001 and 2008, where it had doubled. This is, of course, in some ways biased by the number of the cross-border commuters who contribute to producing the GDP, but are not registered in the country. So this is per capita of the Luxembourg residents. So there are a couple of people who contribute to that missing in the statistics, but nevertheless, even if one would not count these, of course, the level of wealth that was created in this place, particularly by becoming a financial marketplace and service center, is enormous. And meanwhile, the World Bank is listing Luxembourg currently at number 4 of the global rank of nations, judging from per capita GDP, after Monaco, Liechtenstein, and Bermuda. And by the way, one should also note that Luxembourg also heads the global statistics of per capita carbon dioxide emissions, which is about 13 tons, as my colleagues have calculated. And maybe these two figures are more related than the government would like to see this being related. The capital city's demographic evolution over the last 2 decades is also driven by growth, and this growth is almost entirely coming from international migration. And meanwhile, 70% of the capital city's population is as non-Luxembourgish origin, and almost 50% apply to that nationwide. And this is important to know that these people are at least excluded from national voting rights. Of course, the usual argument is they can apply for naturalization and then they get the full voting rights, that as long as you have half of the population of foreign origin in the country, there is a certain deficit in democratic representation, which is quite obvious. We have put together some of these milestones in the whole development of this economic trajectory, which we would consider is it some sort of extroverted orientation. It's very open, very agile. It actually did not start after World War II, but already earlier when this famous holding law was installed in the 1920s. So Luxembourg became prone of attracting corporate investment from elsewhere, was part of the customs union. And then after the war, when it became clear that the steel industry would not hold any longer, then it developed systematically and also accidentally alternatives in the admin sectors, particularly the European Union, and also in the banking, finance, investment fund and other sectors. And we can see that this course of diversification is going on and is further diversifying into financial technology, so-called fintech, in space mining, which got some media attention already, in digital services and infrastructures, data centers, for instance, in arts and finance and alike. So this is actually the general pattern. And this, if you would look, you know this much better than I do. If you look at the financial marketplace in more detail, you can see these different fields of specialization and the related figures. I do not want to focus too much on that. Maybe just one more word on this whole financial thing, because of course, together with a couple of other usual suspects, Luxembourg is still a safe haven for landing corporate profits, which has spurred some latent criticism over the recent past. And that became evident with the publication, for instance, of LuxLeaks in 2014, the Panama Papers in 2016, with some significant participation from Luxembourg lawyers and finance people, and also earlier this year with the so-called Open Lux revelations. This chart is taken from Gabriel Zuckman's database. So what are the urban implications? Being small but global has actually massive and manifold urban implications. In a nutshell, there is a rapid development pressure and urban expansion. There is an ongoing production of territories that are specialized in hosting the key institutions and corporate functions. There's a highly imbalanced ratio between office, real estate, and housing, which is in line with a striking imbalance of work occupation and residential population. And there is, of course, as the country is small and the labor market as well, an increasing pressure or imperative of mobility that caters to the demands of the labor market. The capital city is 52 square kilometers big, and already some 10, 15 years ago presented itself as being very prone to host large-scale urban projects. And city and state are still, partly this is already ongoing or finished, partly still under construction, under planning, and these are the recent places where both government and the capital city are trying to set in place new urban spaces, which are still mostly devoted to office real estate. Office real estate accounts, meanwhile, for about 4 million plus square meters nationwide, of which the biggest proportion, I guess 2/3, is located in the city of Luxembourg, in the capital city. And half of that amount, and this also would justify to take a closer look at the Cashback area, is in this European and banking district on Cashback, and the city's geography situated over here. The Plateau Cashback is the country's biggest and most important development site at all. It comprises no less than 365 hectares of land, currently offers 42,000 jobs, and is meanwhile occupied by about 4,000 residents. It started to development actually by expropriation through the state and took place on a suburban greenfield close to the city on the other side of the River Alzette as early as in the 1960s. And this picture is taken from the city's Phototech, is from mid 1970s, where you can see the city's high riser, and on the left-hand side, or in the middle of the picture, you can see the European Court of Justice. The aim of this development was to find a territory for hosting the European Union institutions and also the emerging banking and financing industries afterwards. Accelerated in the 1980s, it became a hotspot of services and admin economy and national infrastructure. This is how the Cashback, the lower part with the European institutions, looks today, or has looked in 2018. Some of the construction that is visible here is already done and ready. Our research revealed actually that the experience in planning the Cashback for what could be called the global Luxembourg by implanting large-scale urban planning served as a template for other projects as well. So our new research campus Belval in the city and territory of the city of Esch-sur-Alzette is only one case here. And another one is the much blamed office and condo town Cloche Dor in the southern suburbs of the capital city, which is still under completion right now. Time would not allow to go deeper into this, but my argument that there is a certain Cashback syndrome to apply here, so that Cashback is the template for other projects to follow in the same shape and same outline, was already noticed and questioned by a developer who was in charge of building Cloche Dor. Clearly, the preference for large projects creates big tensions for urban integration. And this brings us closer to the system of policy planning and governance that is about to set all this in place. Our point is, contrasting with the extroverted notion of the economy driven by openness, agility, innovation, governance appears to us as a rather introverted system. 3 points are indicative here. A niche of sovereignty as a small but independent nation state. Sovereignty made the difference when it all began. Developing a system of close political steering and control, particularly exerted by the state, which tends to be almost ubiquitous, a typical small state phenomenon also discussed by Katzenstein and others. Mediating the diverging interests of state and communes, particularly by practicing the French system of député maire, which is the double mandates of mayors and municipal councillors who are at the same time members of the national chambers. A closely knit ecosystem of businesses, translators, for instance, special interest media, and the state has ensured the functionality of the marketplace and its leading sectors. Of course, it needed the helping hand of the ubiquitous state to evolve. In the beginning, non-regulation and afterwards regulation has played an essential role for Luxembourg to become what it is now. And it is interesting to see that the increasing degree of regulation requires specialized expertise on these issues. And as one of our interview participants told us, it's harder and harder to follow the rules, and the rules get harder and harder, and you need more and more professionals to run the thing according to the rules. So this explains part of the business secret. What is the spatial governance looking like? First, it is about providing more land for economic purposes, mainly office real estate. However, due to market changes, recently this practice now includes the luxury apartment sector as well, financialization, period. Secondly, old industrial sites like the Belval campus are being converted, most notably through the practice of large-scale urban planning. Thirdly, the connectivity to localities in the greater region are on the government's agenda in order to improve the rail and bus network connections with the neighbors. Land is the key issue here. Once again, Cashback, from which is on which this sketch is about is a template for the ways how state and communes have acted in order to get places settled for foreign investment and international institutions. The leading role here is definitely with the government for financing, steering, developing, and also most of the bargaining. The commune actually remains an observer, as did the civil society for quite a while. Apart from big projects, the majority of redevelopments take place at the micro level, where private landowners sell to private developers, and these developers commission the crafting of a building plan to private planning offices on their own behalf, and finally ask the commune for permit. These massively driven by private interest developments include space for housing and offices. They are drivers of densification, often bringing a ratio of 1:4 or more, but rarely provide affordable housing in the country. And this is one of the current hot issues, hotly debated in politics, that land is scarce and expensive. And all this is going on with private transactions and private property. Luxembourgers are private property owners by more than 70% of the population, and the developable land is by 92% in the hands of private owners, and it's a strategic resource for the economy, of course, and the whole country actually becomes difficult to afford, even for the Luxembourgers by themselves, and that has raised also some significant problems and concern in politics. Of course, as everywhere else, this is nothing specific. Infrastructure alliances are at work, particularly governed and led by the state to get things going and to, for instance, improve airport connections and bring up an airport city concept, but also to improve the accessibility of Cashback and in the capital city by this rail connector and by a new tram in order to cater to the interest of the services class. Time is running, so I'm coming to my conclusions and outlook. How do we see the problem now and also in the wake of these two important events, such as Brexit and COVID-19? Urban prospects are still about further growth. The economy must expand since the general social security system in the country calls for an annual increase of GDP by 4%. Population is expected to reach the mark of 700,000 by 2030 and 1 million by 2050. This is the official projection, and there's no plan B for that. These figures break down logically to the urban levels. And once again, last time I guess I bring a picture of the Cashback area where we have these guiding figures. So currently 42,000 jobs hosted on Cashback, and this is about to grow to, by the end of the 2030s, to 66,000 on the Cashback alone. And this is the everlasting dream of unlimited growth and prosperity. And even though this was projected before the pandemic has hit city and country, that's the mainstream scenario. The 2021 reality looks different and contradictory. On the one hand, you can argue that Luxembourg appears to be one of the winners of Brexit-related relocalizations and also further competitiveness on the financial marketplace. And but this is a gain for the economy, which would, however, increase the pressure on the whole systems of provision on land, accessibility, infrastructure, and also create more inequality. The financial market performs well. See the column at the very left, which indicates the net sales of the Luxembourg investment fund industry in March 2021, by far the best among the 34 markets covered. The place appears largely unaffected by the recent crisis, as it already had quickly recovered after the financial crash of 2008-2009. On the other hand, being a relational city-state formation is challenged by immobilities as a primary impact of COVID-19. This was already the case last year when the borders were closed down to the neighbor countries, and Luxembourg's economy was facing some serious difficulties. Of course, they were letting the commuters in, but there was quite some political trouble and also difficult circumstances for very many people to get to work and get back home. So that's one of the difficulties at the horizon of COVID-19, a pandemic. And a second could be decentralization, which could be considered a means of getting a more balanced development pattern at work, or facing problems because people can simply go somewhere else, which would then also create some issues for the revenues that the government receives from all these issues. So coming to the end, during the peak of COVID-19 events and related restrictions, the city, whose layout follows the motorist interests, both domestic and foreign, quite well, was asked to provide more space for bikers and pedestrians, as it was the case in Paris and Brussels and in many other really metropolitan areas. In the first instance, Lady Mayor declined by making particular reference to the city's history as a medieval fortress. So the bikers were asking, open the fortress, and she said, oh, sorry folks, space is limited. This was the official answer in the very beginning, which also means that the motorcar deserves further priority. The real challenge, however, is structural and is threefold. First, Luxembourg is condemned to keep the economy going because there's a lot to lose. Second, both society and territories need to develop in more balanced, just ways. And then third, there's also something like climate change, maybe the biggest challenge at all. However, any adaptive strategy, this would be my argument, and there are a few strategies that have started to be worked out on recently, requires transparency in the political and planning processes. But this is highly contested. According to a frank statement of the Prime Minister, transparency would undermine the country's business model. It limits the attractiveness of the state for corporate investment. So if you want to know how the government's approach to all these issues is, you can see it from this quote. Thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you. Virtual round of applause. I think everyone learned something, and there was some interesting chat in the chat box. So given we have about 20 minutes for question and answer, I've managed to extract sort of 3 groups of questions from the chat box, and then we can open it up to more general questions. So Markus, the first question was from Derek about regulatory capture. Derek, did you want to clarify that at all?
Oh, yes, thank you, Thomas. So thank you for a great presentation, really, really fun. I just saw the slide on governance. I was wondering you would also use the term and the concept of capture to describe the situation. It's inadequate to this case.
Sorry, I had some difficulties in following you acoustically.
So the question was,
oh, I'm sorry.
Derek, I think your connection may have been breaking up a bit. The question in the chat box was, should regulatory capture of the state by finance in Luxembourg be a key part of governance?
I must ask, what is precisely mentioned with regulatory capture? I must admit that this is not my usual hunting ground. What sort of concept is behind that term?
Can you give us some clarification, Derek?
Yeah, so it's the use of the state apparatus, the influence on this apparatus by the financial sector to promote their own interests, which it's about a minority in any democracy capturing, gaining excessive influence on the state and the government in the way it conducts its policies.
Yes. The short answer is yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Is it getting worse or better?
I don't know whether I'm authorized to make a judgment on that, but the ties are so close between the legal advisors, the corporate consultancy and accounting firms, and the government that you would expect that these links also and LuxLeaks was pretty much about the role of PwC in tax evasion policies. So this is why they were hit so hard by LuxLeaks, because the ties are so close between the government and the corporate landscape there. So this is very much a yes. Whether it's getting worse or not, I don't know whether I have the numbers for comparison, if you want.
I mean, one thing we mentioned the other day, which may or may not resolve the question, is that Luxembourg is literally a duchy, as in it's the sovereignty of the Duke. It's not a republic or anything resembling a republic. So it's literally a feudal structure in terms of governance, which probably adds to the yesness of the yes. There's not much transparent about it. Let's move to Karen and David's debate about the hinterland. So Markus, could you elaborate a bit about Luxembourg and the Luxembourg state apparatus's role in shaping its own geographical hinterland?
Well, that's a pretty much contested issue, as there is, as in other cross-border regions of Europe, there's a sort of tradition in voluntary collaboration between the member states and the regions. But there is, of course, primacy of the own interest of Luxembourg in all these affairs. They need the workforce, but judging from their self-expression, they would not like to be the paymaster for the whole regional setting. So they don't want to pay for all this. And they were subsidizing some of the investments, some of the operations in the neighbor regions in order to ensure proper network connectivity. But this is highly disputed. And there's also the whole tax issue behind. For instance, if teleworking would come into play more broadly, then the question is how to tax these activities if they don't take place on the country's territory. And they have bilateral agreements with the neighbor countries that allow only a very limited amount of days per year that employees can work at home, and otherwise then the French, Belgian, German tax admin would try to get hold of the tax contributions. So all this is a mess. And until recently, we had plans where Luxembourg was presenting some ideas for future development, and it was the whole cross-border area was white. And meanwhile, they work on a sort of collaborative gesture, but it's all voluntary. There's nothing binding, and there's a deep divide between the different interests and also the economic position of the different regions. So Luxembourg is a sponge in the middle and needs all this inflow of capital and people, but they don't want to share their wealth with the other regions, precisely.
I guess following on from that, there was some comparison in the chat to Singapore. So do you want to elaborate on maybe how it would compare against Geneva and Singapore?
Well, these three cases are culturally, historically totally distinct, but there were some striking similarities also in terms of the discourses, and the discourses that maybe the real diverging interests are sometimes hidden by politics and by official languages, but the real discourses reveal how harsh the different positions can be, and also sentiment against foreigners. The so-called transfrontalier, the cross-border workers in Luxembourg, they are the if you want, I wouldn't say underclass for all, but there are quite many who are treated as servants and underclass, also in the way how some of the country's discourses are going on. And this obviously has something in common with how foreign people are treated in Singapore, as I have learned. And maybe it's difficult to compare this because of the totally distinct cultural framework conditions, but there are striking similarities, and what between the Swiss and the French in Geneva, same picture.
And then the question everyone wants to know about is space mining. So how does a country that has no capacity to launch a rocket involved in asteroid and space mining?
I don't know whether they know. If they would know, they would not let us know. And this compares to the Freeport issue, where sometimes it's difficult to get some evidence on what goes on behind these walls, behind these real fortresses. And Sabine and I, we are working on that at the moment, and it looks as if this business model does not work well either in Singapore and in Luxembourg. And space mining is, I would argue, highly speculative. And it's very risky. I wouldn't say it's totally weird because, you know, Luxembourg has been active in the satellite business for some decades. And we're actually radio broadcasting things started in 1924 with RTL. And that has almost vanished. And satellite operations are no longer the cash cow of the country. So there's some logic behind why not going there. But the way they did this and how it looks at the moment, it has become pretty calm about this whole issue. And this indicates that they don't have that many success stories to tell about this issue. I think it's really difficult, and maybe it's a totally long-term thing, as long as traveling to the Mars.
So that gives us about 9 more minutes. Does anyone from the floor have another question that wasn't in the chat? Feel free to simply just turn on your microphone and camera and ask.
Hi, Thomas. I would still have a follow-up question, perhaps. It's David. Thanks, Markus, for your talk. Maybe following on a little bit on the comparison. I think we agree that yeah, every place is unique, and clearly Singapore is completely working in a different kind of cultural or national context. But I also wonder to what extent this prevents us really from comparing these places. And it reminded me a little bit of the older work by Olsen Young on Singapore as a global city-state. So I'm really wondering to what extent in your project this comparative gesture is also part of that, and to what extent the small but global concept is also being used as some kind of an explanatory vehicle. Is it a concept that explains certain financial center formation processes that can also be relevant in other places? So what would happen if we use that concept to start looking at London or New York? What may happen with such a concept?
Oh, I don't know what about London and New York in that respect. Maybe I'm too essentialist in my perception, but I would go to Frankfurt or Dublin because these are relatively smaller places compared to the metropolitan areas. But maybe there are some islands within these larger agglomerations that would fit for study. I use it. I'm actually, if you want, this is my mantra since I'm doing this in Luxembourg and also in the Luxembourg public, as far as the public or the officials are interested in what we do at the university. My mantra is, hey, you can't treat the city as a normal one, like the city of Metz in northern France or the neighbor city Trier in Germany, which are of comparable size, both in population and territory, but this is something totally distinct. And the property of being small but global creates enormous tension. And that's actually the way. And I think this is the case in Geneva, obviously. This is very easy to observe there. And I guess it's also the case in Singapore. And how do these places deal with that tension that comes out of this mismatch between size and power, between small and being global, and trying to remain global? So all these three places have a very consensus-driven, secretive way of dealing with these issues. This is maybe the most striking point, that all the three are not really open and transparent in the way how they deal with that. And I think this has to do with state control. In Geneva, it's the canton, backed by the confederation. And that's really, yeah. So the way how they respond to that, I guess, that's something that would fit for further analysis.
All right, we've got another question from Belgium.
Thank you, Thomas. Also, thanks, Markus, for the lecture. It was great. I was wondering a little bit about the relationship between Luxembourg as a country with its neighboring countries, and especially with France. It seems Luxembourg is mostly dependent on France for cheap labor, so to speak. Cheap, being very relative here. Would you say there's a symbolic relationship between France and Luxembourg? Because probably those cities also need more jobs, and Luxembourg is happy to provide them for those people living in the north of France? Or would you say it's more like a parasitic relationship, where maybe France gets a few benefits, but it's mostly Luxembourg getting the benefits?
I think it's, I wouldn't say it's evenly distributed, but there's a big degree of ambivalence in this relationship. First of all, they are very close culturally about the language and history. That's pretty clear. And you could easily ask, what about Lorraine if there would be no Luxembourg with this sponge labor market function? They would have really problems. But inequality is accelerating, actually. And now Luxembourg is taking the cheap or labor that they need from there, and they are also trying to externalize housing to northern France, as they do with Belgium and with Germany, without doing this deliberately. Maybe this could be something for a joint planning thing in the greater region, to have a housing market region in the greater region, and then to practice that. They don't do that, but you can see that people are simply moving out because they can't afford any longer to live in Luxembourg. And so that's a sort of, maybe parasitic is a bit hard, but yeah, sometimes it reminds me of Bob Beauregard's notion of parasitic urbanization. And this is something that, of course, I guess at the moment, particularly with France and Belgium, Luxembourg is the winner of this relationship. And also they are trying to not to take into account these ambivalences and externalities in that relationship.
All right, so we just have time probably for one more question. So why don't we combine the questions from Karen and Xinyi, because they seem to both be about financial centers. So if you could say something about regional disparities in Luxembourg, and then maybe something about the competition with Luxembourg's offshore financial center.
Well, inequalities are everywhere. They are in the greater region. They are in the country between the capital city and the rest. And they are also in the capital city between different districts. And that's a major issue. And I think politics is quite concerned about that, but maybe they do the wrong thing as a consequence out of it. For instance, hiring private guards for the area around the main station in order to provide some public security, which is pretty weird. But inequality issue is there definitely. And what was the second point?
Sorry, it was Xinyi's question about Luxembourg being challenged by Dublin and Amsterdam.
Well, they are all strong competitors, and the race is going on. And some people were thinking already 2008-9, okay, that's it for the marketplace. And then there was LuxLeaks. That's it now. They would have to go for more transparency and bank secrecy and issues. And now with COVID, some people were also arguing, okay, that's it. And people at the EU are complaining that housing is so expensive in Luxembourg that their qualified staff would like to prefer actually Strasbourg or Brussels. So if you look at the marketplace, it's still performing. And the signals that we as university, we are paid by the government, and the signals that we get for budget planning of this year is, okay, folks, keep calm, things have sorted out, and the figures are looking pretty well. And it's mainly the financial marketplace that brings the state money in for all these investments and all these issues. And some people who have calculated, okay, this will be going down and the whole business model is questioned, they now say, okay, we were wrong once more.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately that's time. Let's thank Markus again for a fantastic presentation. There's obviously a lot of interest in Luxembourg, so I recommend that everyone visits at some point to see it for yourselves. It's quite a nice place. Just to do a little bit of propaganda quickly, we've got 5 more lectures in this lecture series. So we've got fortnightly lectures, and the next one is in exactly 2 weeks on the financialization of Chinese cities and the role of urban investment. And every 2 weeks after that, there's another lecture. So those will be announced both on the RSA website and the FINGEO website. Please sign up for FINGEO if you're not already a member, and for the mailing list. And keep an eye on the Twitter feeds and the various channels we've been sending these around on. A recording, one thing I forgot to mention is a recording of this will be put, I believe, on the FINGEO website, so you can share this with your friends if they weren't able to attend. Thanks everyone for coming, and Karen has just posted the Wander link, so feel free to click on Wander, and when the last person leaves this room, Alex from the RSA will be shutting down the Zoom link in a couple minutes. Thanks everyone, thanks Markus, and have a good day, good evening, good morning.